My name is Caroline Mercer. I am 81 years old, and even now, all these years later, the smell of damp concrete can make my stomach twist. Because once, for weeks that felt like years, I lived in a basement. Not a furnished one with carpet and windows and the hum of a television. No, a basement with stone walls that sweated moisture, a single dangling bulb, and a door that clicked shut above me like the lid of a coffin. My husband locked me there. And the neighbors heard me. They heard my fists against the walls, my cries that rattled the pipes, my voice breaking when I begged for mercy. They heard. And they stayed silent. The day it began was not a stormy night, not a dramatic explosion, but an ordinary Thursday. I think that's what haunts me most. Evil rarely announces itself with lightning. It seeps in through the cracks of routine. That morning I had set bread to rise. I remember because the yeast smell still clung to my hands when Thomas came home early. He shouldn't have been home. He was a man who prized appearances, who never left the office before 6. When I heard his car pull into the driveway at 2 in the afternoon, my heart stuttered. The screen door banged, footsteps thundered across the floorboards, and then his voice, sharp, clipped. "Caroline." I dried my hands quickly, straightened my apron. "In here," I called from the kitchen. He appeared in the doorway, his face flushed, his tie loosened. There was a wildness in his eyes, something unmoored. In his hand, he carried a folded paper. He slapped it onto the counter. Care to explain this? It was a letter. My own handwriting stared back at me. My breath caught. It was the letter I had written weeks earlier, tucked into an envelope meant for the women's shelter in town. A desperate plea for help, never mailed. I thought I had hidden it beneath the lining of my dresser drawer. Somehow Thomas had found it. I opened my mouth, but no words came. He leaned close. "You thought you could betray me, make me a laughingstock. You'll learn, Caroline. You'll learn what silence means." Before I could move, before I could even gasp, his hand clamped around my arm. He dragged me through the hallway, past the living room with its polished furniture, down the narrow staircase that led to the basement. The air grew colder with each step. My heels scraped the wood. I tried to pull free, tried to plead. "Thomas, please, I'm sorry." He shoved me through the doorway. The bulb swayed overhead, throwing shadows across the concrete floor. And then I heard it, the click of the lock as the door shut above me. First I thought it was a mistake. Surely, he would open it in a moment, let out a laugh, say he only wanted to scare me. Waited. Minutes passed. My breath clouded in the chill air. The light buzzed and flickered. Banged on the door. "Thomas." No answer. Called again, louder. "Thomas." Still nothing. I pressed my ear against the wood. I could hear his footsteps retreating, the creak of the floorboards, the slam of the front door. And then silence. Panic rose in me, thick and choking. I pounded the door until my fists ached. I screamed until my throat burned. And then I heard it. Faint, muffled, but unmistakable. A dog barking outside. A child's laughter. The sound of Mrs. Wright, our neighbor, calling to her husband across the hedge. They could hear me. I knew they could. "Help me!" I screamed. "Please, someone help me." My voice echoed against the walls, rose through the pipes, out into the yard where the neighbors worked their garden and hung their laundry. For a moment I thought surely someone would come. The Wrights were kind people. Mr. Miller next door was always offering to fix our fence. Surely they would knock, they would ask questions. But the minutes stretched. The voices outside lowered, then stopped. Silence. The first day in that basement was the longest day of my life. The hours bent, distorted. The bulb flickered. My body shook with cold and fear. I tried to pace, but the walls pressed close, the ceiling low. By evening I heard Thomas return. The door creaked open just long enough for a tray to slide down. Bread. Pitcher of water. Then the door slammed again. "Thomas, please," I begged. The lock clicked, and above me, muffled but clear, I heard the neighbors' voices carrying through the open windows. They had heard me. They knew. And they did nothing. That night I curled on the concrete floor, my cheek pressed to the cold, and realized something. I was not just locked in by my husband. I was locked in by their silence too. The house settled. The pipes groaned. Somewhere upstairs, Thomas whistled a tune. And I made myself a promise. If I ever got out, I would not stay silent. Not like them. Not ever again. But at that moment, all I had was the sound of my own breathing and the darkness pressing close. And I knew, the day everything changed had only just begun. Before we move on, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think so far. People always ask the same question when they hear my story. Why didn't you leave sooner? Why didn't you see it coming? The truth is, monsters don't wear their faces on the first day. They wear smiles. They bring flowers. They say all the right words. Thomas Mercer was no exception. When I met him, I was 19 and naive. It was 1963, and the world told me a woman's highest calling was to marry well, keep a tidy home, and raise polite children. Thomas was older by 6 years, handsome in a clean-cut way, with dark hair that never fell out of place and a voice that carried confidence. When he walked into a room, people noticed. When he looked at me, I felt chosen. He wooed me with attention I didn't know how to resist. He brought me daisies, my favorite. He opened doors, pulled out chairs, told me I was beautiful in ways that made me blush. My parents adored him. "A man with prospects," my father said. "You'll never want for anything." And for a while it felt true. Our wedding was modest but lovely. Our first home, a 2-story with white shutters, sat right in the middle of a friendly neighborhood. The Wrights lived to our left, the Millers to our right. Both families waved from their porches the day we moved in, bringing casseroles and pies to welcome us. I thought I was stepping into a dream. But dreams curdle when you wake up. The cracks began small. The first time was at dinner. I had made pot roast, my mother's recipe. Thomas took one bite, set his fork down and smiled, not warmly but tightly. "Too much salt," he said. "I'll fix it next time," I murmured. "See that you do." The smile never reached his eyes. Another time, I wore a dress he hadn't seen before, a blue one with a hem just above the knee. I twirled, expecting his praise. Instead, his jaw tightened. "Don't wear that outside," he said. "The neighbors don't need to see what belongs to me." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. First I excused it. Stress from work. Old-fashioned values. A man wanting respect. That's what women were taught then. To excuse, to adjust, to bend so the marriage didn't break. But bending turns to breaking before you realize it. By our 3rd year, Thomas's rules governed everything. What I wore. How I styled my hair. When I could visit my parents. Even what I said at neighborhood gatherings. "Smile, Caroline," he would whisper between his teeth as we stood at the Wrights' cookout. "Don't make me look bad." So I smiled. Always. The neighbors saw those smiles. They saw the way I carried trays of lemonade, nodded politely, laughed at the right moments. They didn't see the way Thomas's grip bruised my arm when I forgot to laugh at his joke. Or maybe they did and chose not to ask. Silence has many shapes. Sometimes it's ignorance. Sometimes it's complicity. The first time Thomas raised his hand, I told myself it would never happen again. It was after a church social, when I spoke too long with a deacon's wife. In the car, his voice was low, simmering. "Do you enjoy making me look like a fool?" Before I could answer, his hand struck my cheek. The sound rang in the small car like a gunshot. He apologized the next morning. Bought me lilies. Promised it was stress, that he loved me. I believed him. Because believing him was easier than admitting I had married a cage. Over the years, the walls closed in tighter. He controlled the money, the mail, the phone calls. I had no car unless he gave permission. For your safety, he'd say, as if safety was something you could grant like an allowance. And the neighbors. They saw things. I know they did. Mrs. Wright once caught me in the yard. Sleeves rolled up, bruises blooming along my forearm. She glanced at them, then quickly looked away. "How's your garden coming along, Caroline?" she asked, her voice too bright. Another time Mr. Miller paused at our fence, watching as Thomas barked at me for trimming the hedges unevenly. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, then turned back to his lawn without a word. Each silence was a betrayal. Each silence taught Thomas he could do worse. By the time I wrote that letter, the one he found, the one that sent me to the basement, I was desperate. I had hidden scraps of money, planned escape routes, even memorized the bus schedule to the next town. But fear is a powerful jailer. Each time I thought of leaving, I remembered his threats. "If you ever run, Caroline, I'll find you. And it won't just be you who pays." So I stayed. And the neighbors stayed silent. That silence hardened into something I carried in my bones. It told me that no one would come if I screamed. It told me that appearances mattered more than truth. Told me I was alone. And yet, somewhere deep inside, another truth simmered. If I ever got the chance, if I ever saw daylight again after that basement, I would make them all remember that silence is not safety. I would make them choke on it. The cracks in my marriage had turned into canyons. And the day Thomas found that letter, the day he dragged me down the stairs, the canyon finally swallowed me whole. I thought I had reached the end. But I hadn't yet seen how deep betrayal could go. Because the basement was only the beginning. Hang on, before I tell you what happened next, make sure you've subscribed and left your thoughts in the comments. This part gets intense. The basement became my world. First I thought it would be for a night, maybe two. Punishment, cruel but temporary. But one night stretched into 2, then into 7, then into weeks. I lost track of time the way you lose track of breath when you're drowning. The walls sweated with damp. The bulb overhead buzzed and sputtered, sometimes plunging me into hours of blackness when it burned out and Thomas forgot to replace it. The air smelled of mold, iron pipes, and fear. My body ached from the cold concrete floor. My voice cracked from screaming. And the silence above me. That was the loudest sound of all. The neighbors heard. I know they did. The Wright's bedroom window was barely 10 feet from the basement vent. At night, when I pounded the pipes and begged for help, I could hear them moving about upstairs, their radio humming faintly, their laughter drifting across the yard. Once, I even heard Mrs. Wright call out, "Is that the plumbing again?" Her husband muttered something, and then the window slammed shut. They knew. And they chose to close the window. The Millers heard too. One afternoon, I screamed until my throat bled. Through the vent, I heard their children playing tag in the yard. The game stopped. A small voice whispered, "Mama, someone's crying." And then Mrs. Miller's voice, sharp, hushed. "Inside. Now." Their door closed. Their silence locked me in tighter than any key. First I raged. I clawed the door until my nails split, kicked the walls until my feet bruised, screamed until my voice broke. But rage drains fast when you are cold and alone. It leaves only a hollow echo. Days bled together. I tried to measure time by the meals Thomas slid through the door. A tray of bread, a pitcher of water, sometimes stew that had gone cold by the time it reached me. No words, no eye contact. Just the scrape of the tray, the click of the lock, the steady thud of his footsteps retreating. Once I tried to plead. "Thomas, please, you don't have to do this. I'll be good. I'll be quiet." His voice came through the door, flat and final. "You already are." That's when I understood. The basement wasn't punishment. It was erasure. He wanted me to disappear. And the neighbors were helping him do it by saying nothing. The human mind plays tricks in solitude. I started hearing things. Whispers in the pipes, footsteps that weren't there, my own heartbeat sounding like a second voice. Some nights I swore I heard my mother calling me from the dark. Other nights, I thought I heard the neighbors whispering my name. But the worst was when I heard nothing at all. Silence pressed against my chest like a weight. Told me I was forgotten. It told me I could die down there and no one would care. One night, after what must have been 3 weeks, I broke. I lay on the floor, too weak to stand, my cheek pressed against the cold concrete. The bulb had burned out again, leaving me in darkness so thick I could barely tell if my eyes were open. My body trembled with fever. My lips cracked from thirst. My ribs ached with each breath. And I thought, this is how I die. Not in a blaze of tragedy. Not in a car accident or a house fire. Just here, in a basement, erased by silence. I whispered into the dark, not even sure who I was talking to. Please, someone see me. No one answered. That was the lowest point of my life. And yet, in that darkness, something shifted. Because the silence that had been crushing me suddenly felt different. Heavy, yes, but not unbreakable. I thought of the neighbors, of their windows slamming shut, of their children hushed inside. I thought of their silence like a wall. And for the first time I realized walls can be torn down. My body was broken, but my mind began to plan. I started saving scraps. Bits of bread crust. Threads from the hem of my dress. Anything I could keep hidden in the crack behind the furnace. Small, pathetic treasures, but they gave me purpose. And more than scraps, I saved memories. I repeated to myself every sound I'd heard from outside. The Wrights' radio, the Miller children's laughter, the whispered, "Mama, someone's crying." I recited them like scripture. Proof I wasn't mad. Proof the world knew and chose silence. The silence no longer crushed me. Fed me. Because one day I promised myself I would take it. I would gather all the silence they had wrapped around me, all the silence that had kept me buried, and I would fling it back at them like a weapon. That vow kept me alive. And the moment to fulfill it came sooner than I expected. It was a Tuesday morning when the bolt slipped. Thomas had grown careless. The lock clicked, but the door stuck half an inch ajar. I stared at it in disbelief, my body too weak to move at first. Then, with a trembling hand, I pushed. The door creaked open. Daylight poured down the stairs like salvation. I staggered up, each step a mountain. When I reached the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee nearly undid me. I gripped the counter, gasping, staring at the sunlight flooding through the window. I was out. I was alive. And in that moment, weak as I was, one thought blazed in me hotter than hunger, thirst, or fear. It wasn't escape. It was revenge. Before we go any further, click subscribe and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my shoes? When the basement door creaked open that morning, I didn't just crawl out of darkness. I crawled into clarity. I was no longer the woman Thomas had dragged down those stairs. The Caroline he tried to erase was gone. What rose back into daylight was something sharper, harder. I remember standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, my legs trembling beneath me. Sunlight streamed through the window, painting gold across the floor. For weeks I had lived in shadow, and now the light hurt my eyes, but I forced myself to stare into it. I swore I would never return to the dark. Not without dragging them all into it first. Revenge wasn't an idea that came in a flash. It was something that grew slowly, curling around my ribs, fed by every memory of silence. Every slammed window. Every hushed child. Every moment Thomas's footsteps retreated while my fists bled against the basement door. I didn't want revenge just on him. I wanted it on all of them. My husband, my neighbors, every complicit ear that had heard me cry and chosen not to move. But I knew I couldn't rush. Rage burns hot and fast, but it doesn't last. If I wanted this to work, I needed patience. I needed to plan the way Thomas planned his control, Carefully, deliberately, one brick at a time. The first step was survival. I gathered strength in secret. While Thomas believed I was meek again, grateful to be back upstairs, I ate every scrap of food he offered, saving energy for what I knew was coming. I drank water until my body felt less like stone. I forced myself to walk the yard when he allowed it, each step retraining muscles that had forgotten motion. And as I rebuilt my body, I sharpened my mind. I wrote. I found a loose floorboard in the pantry and slipped paper beneath it. Journal entries detailing every moment in that basement, every sound from the neighbors, every word Thomas had spat. I wrote it all down, not as memory but as evidence. Proof that I had not imagined it. Proof that silence had accomplices. The second step was watching. I watched Thomas the way prey watches a predator, noting his routines, his weaknesses, his carelessness. He liked whiskey after supper, 2 glasses that always made him sloppy. He liked control, but he also liked pride, which meant he bragged at work and with neighbors about his perfect household. That pride was a chink in his armor. I watched the neighbors too. Mrs. Wright watered her begonias every morning at 8 sharp, glancing occasionally at our house but never lingering. Mr. Miller smoked on his porch at night, tapping ash into a tray, eyes darting when he thought no one noticed. Their avoidance was loud. Guilt always is. The third step was patience. I knew one misstep could land me back in the basement, and this time Thomas wouldn't let the lock slip. So I smiled when I had to. I served coffee when asked. I nodded at the Wrights across the hedge. I pretended. And all the while I carried the vow inside me, soon. The turning point came the day I found Thomas's ledger. He kept it in his desk drawer, half hidden beneath bills and receipts. Inside, neat columns tracked every household expense, every dollar spent. But among them were notations I hadn't expected. Donations to the church, gifts to the mayor's fund, payments to men at the mill. He was buying reputation brick by brick, ensuring the town saw him as untouchable. And suddenly I knew how to break him. Not by running. Not by screaming. Not even by killing him. By exposing him. But I couldn't do it alone. So I began to plant seeds. I slipped anonymous notes into mailboxes. Short, sharp lines written in block letters. Did you hear her cries? You chose silence. The basement remembers. The Wrights found one tucked under their doormat. The Millers found one in their hedge. I watched their faces pale when they read. Their eyes dart nervously toward our house. Guilt again blooming like rot. Next, I made copies of the pages I'd written. I slid them into hymnals at church, into magazines at the grocer, into the mayor's mail drop. Words that told of silence, of neighbors who shut windows, of a husband who locked his wife away. I didn't sign them. I didn't need to. The truth doesn't always need a name to cut deep. And then I waited. Whispers began. I heard them ripple through the pews at church, caught them in the way people shifted when Thomas walked by. He felt it too. His pride, his precious image, began to crack. His voice grew sharper at home, his hand heavier. But I didn't break. Not this time. Because I knew what was coming. I was building toward a moment. The moment when silence could no longer protect them. The moment when their complicity would be dragged into light, just as I had been dragged into darkness. I dreamed of it at night, lying in bed with Thomas's breath heavy beside me. I dreamed of the church filled with faces, of the neighbors' children wide-eyed, of the mayor clutching his hat. I dreamed of standing where everyone could hear me and forcing silence to finally speak. But dreams weren't enough. I needed a stage. And fate, or maybe justice, handed it to me. The church announced a neighborhood meeting, a gathering to celebrate the strength of our community. The Wrights were on the committee. The Millers were to host refreshments. And Thomas, of course, was asked to speak on family values. I nearly laughed when I heard it. It was perfect. The stage was set. The neighbors complicit. The church filled. My husband ready to boast. And me ready to tear it all apart. That night, I slipped into the pantry, pulled the journals from beneath the floorboard, and stacked them neatly. I touched the cover, my hand steady. Had planned. I had waited. Now it was time to deliver. Real quick. Subscribe and share your thoughts below before we get to the part that still makes my heart race. The church bell rang on the evening of the meeting, its deep toll rolling across Willow Bend like a warning. I walked toward the chapel with my journals pressed against my chest, the worn leather covers warm from my grip. Each page inside felt alive, humming with the truth I'd buried for too long. Neighbors drifted in ahead of me, smiling their polite smiles, shaking hands, adjusting ties. Mrs. Wright carried a tray of cookies. Mr. Miller lit a cigarette outside and crushed it under his shoe before stepping inside. Their faces were calm, practiced, but I saw the flicker in their eyes when they glanced at me. Guilt is a shadow you can't hide, no matter how bright the lights. Thomas stood near the front, speaking with the pastor. He wore his best suit, navy with a red tie. His hair combed neatly back. He looked every inch the respectable husband, the pillar of the community. He turned when I entered, his smile practiced. "Caroline," he said, voice smooth. "Glad you could join." I met his gaze, unflinching. For the first time in decades I felt no fear, only certainty. The service began with hymns, then words of gratitude for the bonds of our neighborhood, the values that hold us strong. I sat quietly, my journals resting on my lap. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from anticipation. Then it was Thomas's turn. He walked to the pulpit, papers in hand, and began his speech. "Family is the cornerstone of community," he declared. "It is in our homes that we build strength, discipline, and values that carry us forward." I almost laughed at the hypocrisy, but I waited. He droned on, praising the neighborhood's unity, boasting of shared responsibility, while my stomach churned at the lies. And when he paused to sip water, I rose. "Enough," I said, my voice steady, carrying across the pews. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled. Thomas's eyes flashed, his hand tightening on the pulpit. "Caroline, sit down," he hissed through his teeth. "No," I said. I walked to the front, my journals in hand, and faced the crowd. "You want to talk about family values? Then let's talk about what really happens behind closed doors. Let's talk about silence." Gasps echoed. The pastor shifted uneasily. The Wrights exchanged nervous glances. I opened the first journal, its pages worn, my handwriting cramped but fierce. I read aloud. March 12th, Thomas locked me in the basement. I screamed until my throat bled. Through the vent, I heard the Wrights' radio. They turned it louder. Whispers surged. Mrs. Wright's face went pale. I flipped to another page. March 19th. The Miller children heard me crying. They told their mother. She hushed them and pulled them inside. They knew. And they chose silence. Mr. Miller shifted in his seat, sweat beading his forehead. Thomas slammed his hand on the pulpit. "Lies," he shouted. "She's hysterical. Pay her no mind." The congregation buzzed, shock rippling through every pew. Thomas's face reddened. "Enough, Caroline," he roared. I turned on him, my voice sharp as glass. "No, you've had enough. Enough silence. Enough lies." I dropped the journals onto the pulpit. Pages fanned open, evidence spilling across the wood. This is my basement. Every bruise, every cry, every slammed window. Written down. Remembered. And now exposed. The pastor stammered. "Perhaps we should." But I cut him off. "No. You all sat here for years, praising families like ours, pretending not to see. Tonight you will see. You will hear. And you will remember." My gaze locked on Thomas. For the first time his mask cracked. His hands trembled. His perfect image splintered under the weight of truth. And then I turned to my neighbors. You had a choice. You could have knocked. You could have asked. You could have saved me. Instead you chose silence. And silence makes you guilty. The Wrights looked down at their laps. The Millers clutched each other, faces ashen. The truth had landed. I stepped back, my chest heaving. The room was heavy with shame, with revelation. I felt the power shift, felt decades of silence crumble. I looked at them all and said, I was buried alive in that basement. But tonight I bury the silence that kept me there. And with that I walked out. The night air was cool, the stars sharp against the sky. Behind me voices rose. Shock, whispers, arguments. Thomas shouting. The neighbors stammering. But none of it mattered. Because for the first time in my life I was free. Free not because Thomas had unlocked the door, not because the neighbors had saved me, but because I had spoken. Because I had turned their silence into my weapon. I walked down the church steps, my journals clutched against me like a shield, and I smiled. They had locked me in a basement. The neighbors had heard and done nothing. But in the end I made them all hear me. And I made sure they would never forget. They thought silence would erase me. My husband thought a basement would bury me. The neighbors thought shutting their windows would free them of guilt. But silence does not protect the innocent. It protects the guilty. And the day I walked out of that basement, I made sure their silence became my weapon. If this story gripped you, if you believe no voice should ever be buried, then join me here. Subscribe to this channel, share these stories, and make sure the world never forgets. Silence is deadly, but truth will always be louder.